Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. In a world that often seeks certainty, categories, and stability, we take a different approach. Here we explore the questions that unsettle us, the ideas that refuse to be contained, and the ways in which philosophy can illuminate not just abstract thought, but the lived experience of change. Today's episode takes us into one of the most profound debates in philosophy, the contrast between being and becoming. We often think of ourselves, our knowledge, and our institutions as fixed, as though there is a stable truth we must discover and hold on to. But what if reality is not about permanence but process? What if growth, transformation, and adaptation are not disruptions of order, but the very nature of existence itself? Through the insights of Nietzsche, Bergson, and Whitehead, we will explore how this perspective challenges conventional wisdom in science, identity, and institutions. We will also consider how humour, creativity, and self-overcoming can serve as pathways to embracing change rather than fearing it. This is not just a theoretical discussion. It is an invitation to explore more about the concepts and thinkers discussed, including Nietzsche's will to power, Bergson's philosophy of duration, and Whitehead's process metaphysics. Please go to the description where you'll find a link to the episode webpage, which includes additional reading, resources, and recommendations. Let's begin. The modern world is obsessed with stability. From the way we categorize identities to the way we structure institutions, we are constantly trying to define, label, and fix things in place. But what if this obsession with stability is an illusion? One that blinds us to the reality of change? What if our insistence on certainty is the very thing that limits our ability to understand the world, ourselves, and the forces shaping our future? We often seek clarity by placing things into firm categories, believing that stability provides security. Systems of knowledge, personal identities, and societal structures are designed as though they must remain constant. The expectation is that we discover who we are, define our beliefs, and then hold on to them as though they were fixed truths. This mindset creates a sense of order, but it also introduces a deep fragility. When the world shifts, and it always does, people find themselves unprepared, unable to adapt, trapped within assumptions that no longer serve them. Yet this belief in permanence is at odds with how life actually unfolds. Change is not an aberration. It is the rule. Everything, from the smallest cells in our bodies to the largest galaxies, exists in a state of flux. Ideas evolve, cultures transform, and individual identities are shaped by experience and time. If we look closely, we see that what we perceive as stability is often just a momentary pause in an ongoing process of becoming. The challenge is not to resist this reality, but to understand how to live within it. This illusion of stability has deep philosophical roots. The ancient philosopher Parmenides argued that reality is ultimately unchanging, that what appears to be transformation is mere illusion. His perspective shaped centuries of thought, influencing not only philosophy, but also the way knowledge, institutions, and even personal identities have been structured. The counterpoint to this view comes from Heraclitus, who saw change as the fundamental nature of existence. "No one steps in the same river twice," he famously stated, reminding us that both the river and the person stepping into it are constantly in motion. Despite Heraclitus's insights, the tendency to treat things as fixed continues to dominate. Institutions are built as though they are meant to last forever, even when history shows that no structure remains unchanged. People hold on to identities they formed years ago, even when those identities no longer reflect who they have become. The pursuit of permanence leads to fragility, making us resistant to necessary transformations in our personal and collective lives. But what if we approached life differently? What if we saw change not as something to fear, but as something to embrace? What if we understood identity as an unfolding process rather than a fixed definition? This would require a fundamental shift in perspective, one that acknowledges that stability is often a comforting illusion, and that true strength lies not in resisting change, but in learning how to move with it. In a world that is always shifting, the ability to navigate becoming is not just a skill, it is a necessity. For centuries, the dominant intellectual paradigm has been one of stability, categorization, and control. Knowledge, identity, and society have been shaped by the belief that truth is something fixed, something that can be discovered, labelled, and preserved. This assumption is so deeply embedded in our thinking that it often goes unnoticed. We instinctively trust in the permanence of institutions, the reliability of categories, and the supposed objectivity of facts. But beneath this illusion lies a far messier reality, one that defies our attempts to pin it down. This tendency to seek stability is not simply a product of human psychology. It has been reinforced through centuries of philosophical tradition. The roots of this thinking stretch back to Parmenides, who argued that true reality consists of unchanging eternal forms. What we perceive as change, he claimed, is merely illusion, appearances shifting while the underlying truth remains the same. This idea became foundational in Western philosophy, influencing Plato's theory of forms, which insisted that the physical world is only a shadow of a more real, immutable realm. Over time, this belief in fixed structures was absorbed into religion, science, and political institutions, shaping the way we understand everything from identity to natural laws. Yet history repeatedly disproves this illusion of permanence. Every system that claimed to be unshakable has, in time, been dismantled. Civilizations rise and fall, traditions shift, and ideas once considered absolute are replaced by new ways of thinking. Even the most enduring assumptions, such as the belief in an unchanging human nature, have been exposed as contingent, shaped by historical forces rather than eternal truths. The pursuit of stability has never stopped the reality of change. This belief in being over becoming is reinforced by modern institutions. Legal frameworks are built around precedent, resisting adaptation even when circumstances demand it. Educational systems teach knowledge as though it were a collection of settled facts rather than evolving inquiry. Even in science, the search for universal laws often assumes that nature operates according to fixed principles, rather than recognizing that reality itself may be dynamic. The result is a world that constantly tries to impose order onto what is fundamentally fluid. But the cracks in this worldview are becoming harder to ignore. In an age of rapid technological disruption, shifting global dynamics, and new discoveries about consciousness and life itself, the assumption that we can maintain control is increasingly untenable. Artificial intelligence challenges our very definition of intelligence, raising questions about whether cognition can be reduced to fixed principles. Climate change reveals economic and political models designed for a world of stability are ill-equipped to handle large-scale ecological shifts. In the face of these challenges, the illusion of being is proving not just outdated, but actively limiting. Yet instead of confronting this reality, we often resist it. We enforce rigid identity categories, hold on to traditional knowledge structures, and insist that past models must contain the solutions for the future. This is the final trap of the paradigm of being. It does not simply misrepresent reality, it resists change even when change is necessary. And in doing so, it leaves us unprepared for the world that is already unfolding around us. Nietzsche saw this illusion of stability as one of the greatest obstacles to human flourishing. He argued that the most dangerous thing a person or a society could do was to mistake the current state of things for the way things must be. He rejected the idea that truth was something fixed, something that could be discovered once and for all. Instead, he saw truth as something that emerges through conflict, reinvention, and creative destruction. The world, in his view, was not a collection of stable entities, but a dynamic field of forces constantly shifting and evolving. To live as though things were fixed was to live in denial. This is why he valued humour in philosophy. A great thinker in Nietzsche's eyes was not someone who merely analysed the world, but someone who could subvert it, who could expose the absurdity of the things we take most seriously. Comedy at its best reveals the cracks in the systems we assume are unbreakable. It highlights contradictions in our beliefs, the fragility of our institutions, and the ways in which our deepest convictions are shaped by historical circumstances rather than absolute truth. A well-placed joke can do more to undermine a rigid ideology than the most carefully constructed argument. It forces people to see what they would rather ignore. This is why humour has always been a tool of intellectual, and cultural resistance. The structures that enforce stability, whether political, religious, or institutional, are often intolerant of laughter. They depend on the illusion of permanence, on the belief that their authority is absolute. Humor disrupts this by exposing the artificiality of the structures we assume to be natural. A joke about an outdated law, a crumbling institution, or an unquestioned social norm does not simply entertain. It challenges the assumption that things must remain as they are. But humor is not just a weapon against external authority, it is also a tool for personal liberation. The ability to laugh at oneself is a recognition that the self is not a fixed entity, but an ongoing process. Nietzsche's critique of being was not just directed at institutions, but at individuals who cling too tightly to an identity, who seek security in fixed beliefs, rather than embracing the uncertainty of becoming. To insist that I am this and nothing else is to deny the possibility of growth, to shut down the very process that makes life meaningful. This is the paradox of Nietzsche's thought. To fully affirm life, one must be willing to destroy one's most cherished assumptions about it. One must be willing to mock oneself, to question everything, to embrace the possibility that what seems most certain today may be overturned tomorrow. Most people find this terrifying, which is why they resist it. They cling to fixed categories, to stable identities, to the illusion that they can find permanent ground beneath their feet. But Nietzsche would argue that real strength does not come from stability. It comes from the willingness to stand in the midst of change, and instead of resisting it, laugh. If Nietzsche saw humor as a weapon against rigidity, he saw science, at least in its traditional form, as one of the greatest enforcers of the illusion of being. For centuries, the scientific project has been driven by the search for fundamental, unchanging truths. From Newton's laws of motion to the periodic table, from genetic codes to the laws of thermodynamics, science has been structured around the idea that reality can be reduced to stable principles, that the world can be measured, categorized, and ultimately controlled. This mindset has led to extraordinary progress, but it has also blinded us to an essential fact. Life itself does not conform to the logic of being. Process philosophers like Bergson and Whitehead challenged this assumption. They argued that the fundamental nature of reality is not static, but dynamic, that existence is not a collection of objects, but an ongoing process. Bergson, in particular, criticized the way science tries to freeze time into discrete units, as though the flow of existence could be captured in a series of still images. He argued that time is not a collection of moments, but a continuous unfolding, something that cannot be fully grasped by the methods of measurement and classification. To truly understand life, he insisted, we must think in terms of duration, of movement, of becoming, rather than being. Nowhere is the failure of scientific reductionism more apparent than in the field of artificial intelligence. AI, as it exists today, is built on the premise that intelligence can be broken down into patterns, that cognition can be mapped onto a system of algorithms and data points. The assumption is that if we just gather enough information, if we refine our models enough, we'll eventually recreate human intelligence. But this assumption rests on a fatal error. It mistakes knowledge for understanding, data for experience. AI can recognize patterns, but it cannot think. It can process information, but it cannot create. It operates within fixed categories, unable to grasp the fluid, unpredictable nature of real intelligence. The reason AI fails to replicate human thought is the same reason that traditional science struggles to account for consciousness. Both are processes, not things. Consciousness is not an object that can be isolated and studied in a vacuum. It is an emergent phenomenon, inseparable from the flow of existence. Attempts to map it onto stable principles inevitably fall short because they are looking for something that does not exist. Intelligence, like life itself, is not something that can be reduced to a formula. It is improvisational, adaptive, unpredictable. It does not reside in being, but in becoming. This is not to say that science is without value, but it is to say that its greatest breakthroughs have come not from reinforcing stability, but from embracing uncertainty. The shift from Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics shattered the assumption that the universe operates according to fixed, deterministic rules. The theory of evolution replaced the idea of species as fixed categories with a vision of constant adaptation and transformation. The future of science lies not in deeper reductionism, but in a fuller acceptance of process, in the recognition that reality is not something to be frozen and defined, but something to be engaged with as it unfolds. The illusion of being is not just embedded in science and philosophy, it is the foundation of many institutional structures. Stability is the currency of governance, education, and cultural traditions, and institutions thrive on the belief that the systems they create are permanent. Laws, norms, and societal frameworks are often presented as fixed realities, as though they are natural facts rather than evolving constructs. This illusion provides order, but it also comes at a cost. If people were to see these systems as fluid, subject to revision, adaptation, or even obsolescence, the authority of those who maintain them would be weakened. This belief in permanence shapes how institutions respond to change. Many resist adaptation, insisting on the preservation of long-standing structures even when new conditions demand evolution. Educational models, for example, often assume that knowledge is a stable body of information to be transferred, rather than an ongoing dialogue that must shift with new discoveries and cultural transformations. Legal systems are built around precedent, making them slow to adjust even when emerging social realities render old frameworks inadequate. The idea that stability itself is a virtue leads to a paradox. The more an institution clings to the illusion of being, the more vulnerable it becomes when change inevitably arrives. History has repeatedly shown that societies that mistake their current form for their final one become fragile. Institutions that refuse to adapt to shifting conditions eventually collapse under their own weight. Traditions that claim to be eternal are exposed as temporary. Even systems that once seemed indispensable often become outdated or irrelevant. The more rigid a structure, the more likely it is to break rather than bend. This is not an argument for instability for its own sake. Change should not be pursued recklessly, nor should every long-standing institution be discarded simply because it has endured. But there is a fundamental difference between recognizing change as necessary and resisting it as a threat. The assumption that what has worked in the past will always work in the future ignores a simple reality. The world is not static. Knowledge evolves, social conditions shift, and technological advancements reshape human life in unpredictable ways. If institutions do not evolve with them, they risk becoming obstacles rather than facilitators of human progress. A society oriented toward becoming would not treat stability as an absolute good, but as a temporary state, something that serves a function but must be open to transformation. It would not seek to preserve institutions exactly as they are, but to ensure they remain responsive to change. It would recognize that governance, education, and cultural traditions are not monuments to be maintained, but processes to be continuously refined. This requires a fundamental shift in mindset. Instead of treating existing structures as permanent, we must approach them as provisional, as things that serve a purpose only as long as they continue to meet human needs. The most successful institutions are not those that resist change, but those that embrace it. Those that understand that their strength lies not in their ability to endure unchanged, but in their ability to adapt and transform. Identity has long been treated as something to be discovered, defined, and maintained, as though it were a fixed essence rather than an evolving process. From childhood, we are asked to declare who we are, to categorize ourselves into roles, to develop a sense of self that is coherent and stable. The expectation is not only that we know ourselves, but that this knowledge remains consistent, that once we have defined our identity, we should adhere to it. Yet, this way of thinking is at odds with the reality of human experience. Identity is not something static that we find. It is something that emerges, shifts, and evolves throughout our lives. The language we use reinforces the illusion of fixed identity. We say, "I am this," rather than "I am becoming this." We construct narratives about ourselves that emphasize continuity over transformation, treating change as a deviation rather than an essential feature of being human. But if we look at our own lives honestly, we see that we are never the same person for long. The self we were 5 years ago is not the self we are today, and the self we will be in 5 years is unknowable to us now. The expectation that we must remain consistent is not just unrealistic, it is a limitation on what we might become. This rigidity is reinforced not only by personal expectations, but also by social and cultural pressures. Once we have been placed into a category, whether based on profession, belief, or personal identity, deviation from that category is often met with resistance. We are encouraged to define ourselves in simple declarative terms, as though identity was something that could be fixed in place. But this expectation creates a form of self-imprisonment. The person who fears changing their mind because they have already committed to a particular worldview, the individual who resists personal transformation because it would contradict their past self, these are not acts of strength but of limitation. Nietzsche warned against the dangers of defining oneself too rigidly. He saw the self as an ongoing experiment, a project that should never be completed. To insist on a fixed identity is to deny the possibility of growth, to shut down the process of self-overcoming. He argued that the strongest individuals were not those who clung to a single version of themselves, but those who had the courage to shed old identities and embrace new possibilities. But this kind of transformation requires a willingness to let go of certainty, to accept that we are unfinished, that we are always in flux. What if we embraced identity as a process rather than a fixed state? What if we stopped expecting coherence and instead accepted contradiction, evolution, and change as natural aspects of being human? This would require a shift in how we understand ourselves, not as beings, but as becomings. It would mean giving up the idea that we must always know exactly who we are, in favor of the idea that we are always in the process of becoming something new. The self is not a monument to be preserved. It is a river that must be allowed to flow. Humor has always been one of the most powerful tools for revealing the fragility of what we take to be permanent. It undermines rigid structures, exposes contradictions, and reminds us that the things we assume to be fixed are, in fact, contingent. A joke can dismantle an entire ideology in a way that argument alone cannot. Laughter is not just amusement, it is an act of defiance against the illusion of being. It is a recognition that what appears stable is, in reality, precarious, that what seems unshakable is, in fact, absurd. Nietzsche understood the power of humor in philosophy. He did not simply refute rigid systems of thought, he mocked them. He ridiculed the idea of absolute truths, eternal moral codes, and fixed identities. His critique of being was not just intellectual, it was playful, irreverent, and subversive. He saw that seriousness itself could be a form of dogma, a way of resisting the unsettling reality of becoming. When we take things too seriously, whether it be institutions, beliefs, or even ourselves, we make them rigid, and in doing so, we make them vulnerable. The moment we can laugh at something, we loosen its grip on us. This is why humor has always been seen as dangerous by those who seek to impose order. Institutions that rely on stability cannot afford to be laughed at. Systems that demand authority crumble in the face of ridicule. Laughter is disruptive because it refuses to accept that things must remain as they are. It introduces uncertainty where certainty is assumed. It refuses to take fixed identities, rigid traditions, and absolute truths at face value. In this way, humor is an affirmation of becoming. It refuses to let things remain static, forcing them instead into movement. But humor is not just a weapon against external authority, it is also a tool for self-liberation. The ability to laugh at oneself is the ability to recognize that we too are not fixed entities, that our identities, beliefs, and convictions are not sacred but shifting. The person who is incapable of laughing at themselves is the person who is most trapped by their own rigid sense of self. To laugh at oneself is to acknowledge that we are works in progress, that we are unfinished, that we are always in the process of becoming. This is why humor is so closely linked to creativity. The most creative minds are those that refuse to be bound by convention, that see the absurdity in what others take for granted. The artist, the philosopher, and the comedian all share this in common. They resist the illusion of being and instead embrace the chaos, the unpredictability, the openness of becoming. They remind us that nothing is final, that everything can be reimagined, that what seems solid is, in fact, always in motion. If we truly wish to embrace becoming, we must learn to laugh, not just at the world, but at ourselves. To take oneself too seriously is to deny change, to cling to a version of the self that no longer exists. But to laugh is to acknowledge that we are in flux, that we are unfinished, that we are free. If there is one truth that emerges from this exploration, it is that nothing is ever truly fixed, not our knowledge, not our identities, not the institutions we build. The question is not whether we can stop change, but how we choose to engage with it. If becoming is the fundamental nature of reality, then our task is not to resist it, but to learn how to live within it, not as passive observers, but as active participants in the unfolding of our own existence. What does this mean in practice? It begins with a shift in mindset, a willingness to see uncertainty not as a failure of knowledge, but as the space in which growth occurs. It means questioning our own assumptions, recognizing that what feels like certainty today may not hold tomorrow. It means allowing ourselves to evolve, to shed outdated identities, to engage with new ideas without fear of contradiction. The greatest mistake is not to change too much, but to change too little, to cling so tightly to what we once believed that we no longer allow ourselves to become something new. Practically, this means embracing curiosity as a daily discipline. It means seeking out perspectives that challenge our own, rather than reinforcing what we already think. It means engaging with art, literature, and philosophy not as static truths, but as invitations to reconsider our assumptions. It means allowing ourselves to be wrong, not as a weakness, but as a necessary step toward deeper understanding. In personal identity, it means resisting the pressure to define ourselves too rigidly. We often feel compelled to declare who we are, as though identity is something to be discovered and then defended. But if we see identity as an ongoing process, we can give ourselves permission to grow, to explore, to contradict, to outgrow past versions of ourselves. Rather than fearing inconsistency, we can embrace it as a sign of life. In institutions, it means recognizing that stability is not the same as permanence. Systems that function well today may not function well tomorrow. The challenge is not to preserve institutions exactly as they are, but to ensure that they remain adaptable, that they serve people rather than force people to conform to them. A society that understands becoming will not fear change, but will build structures that evolve alongside human needs. Most importantly, living with becoming requires a kind of existential courage, the ability to let go of the illusion of finality and step into the unknown. This is not an easy task. The mind craves stability, and the temptation to retreat into certainty is strong. But the cost of that certainty is stagnation, and the risk of clinging to a static identity, a rigid belief system, or an outdated institution is that we eventually become disconnected from reality itself. In the end, the question is not whether we will change, but whether we will change consciously, creatively, and willingly. To live with becoming is to embrace uncertainty as the ground of possibility. It is to see every moment as an opportunity to create, to rethink, to grow. It is to recognize that there is no final destination, only the ongoing dynamic process of becoming itself. And that is not something to fear, it is something to celebrate. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. For research, reading, resources, and recommendations, visit the episode webpage linked in the description. Until next time.